So, we were talking about the famine relief mission that started in chapter 11 with the prophet, whoever he is, called Agabus, and I don't even think that's a name even in American, and I'm sure it wasn't a name in either Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, or Hebrew, or Latin, but I think it is a garbling of something. You see, that's the weird thing, you know, sometimes these things actually give you an indication, just like the Stephen episode, when we saw the problem in the speech Stephen made concerning the tomb that Abraham bought, and we looked in the Bible, we found actually Abraham bought his tomb in Hebron, but actually it was Jacob who bought the tomb in Shechem. The average person who has no sense of Palestinian geography, which would be 99.9999% of all Aztec Indians converted to Christianity, this wouldn't mean a thing to them. No, it wouldn't mean a thing to Bulgarians either, but it would mean something to Palestinians and people in the Middle East generally. They would know the difference between Shechem and Hebron. And these would be really big matters to them. It would be like, you know, saying to you, so-and-so bought a field in San Francisco, not in Los Angeles. And you'd say, what? What are you saying? We know that Marilyn Monroe's buried in Los Angeles. She's not buried in San Francisco, okay? And you'd get really angry. But if you didn't know anything about America and you were from Tahiti or someplace and someone had that, would make any impression. That's why no one ever brings these things up over time, because they don't have a feel for Palestinian geography. You and I do, because we've been there, but most people haven't been there. So, when you look in that and you see, you go and you find out the passage in Joshua where that's mentioned, what the tomb Joshua bought from the sons of Shechem, and so on, where Joseph was ultimately buried, etc. The Israelis and the Palestinians are fighting over it even today. Then you look there, suddenly it's right after a whole long speech by Joshua, and then you see the whole long speech by Joshua to the assembled tribes. Looks almost just like the speech from Stephen in Acts, and then you begin to be curious about what the author was saying. We know he didn't have a tape recorder, so you start to worry about where he got his material, even if you're a believer. You know, this is not unbeliever-believer stuff. This is people who have minds and think, because once you see that error, that hits it. So here's another one. Once you see Agabus, and you see the famine, and you're not terribly convinced there were a lot of prophets in those days running around, despite Monty Python's Life of Brian. How many have seen Life of Brian? Well, if you haven't seen Life of Brian, you will admit that they're missing something, right? I mean, that's a spoof if nothing else. I mean, it's insane, but I mean, it's not something I would like to, you know, recommend for a bedtime story or something. But if you're drunk or something and you want to have a laugh, right? It's good for laughs. Anyway, you know, only something like Life of Brian, I think, would have a lot of these mad prophets running around and so on. And he predicts the famine, and so we go to Josephus and we find that Josephus is talking at this time about the famine relief mission of Helen of Adiabene, Queen Helen. And also we heard from the Eusebius about her husband, or potential husband, as we saw Agabus or Abgarus, and there's the ABG, you know, configuration of letters. You begin to realize that the author of Acts, despite the fact that we understand he's of divine inspiration, is not being so careful about these things, and then you begin to think perhaps he's derived that name from that tradition, that he's either remembered or he's playing some little, you know, obscure game with or something like that. So if you're a cynic like me, you think he's playing a game. If you're a kind person, you just think, well, he's working off of oral traditions and it's garbled along the way. In any case, Agabus wasn't a prophet, but we do know that we're going to come on to prophets and teachers of the church in Antioch pretty soon. They come down what's the coming down to Antioch here theme? We're going to have it about 3 or 4 different times. I think you could just compress all the coming down to Antioch things into more or less one coming down to Antioch. I think you'll find that the one real coming down to Antioch will be after the Jerusalem conference in chapter 15. Now you've been reading ahead presumably. Who comes down to Antioch after chapter 15? Or at the end of chapter 15?
Some Jewish.
2 messengers from, well, let's just take a look at it. James, which links up then with Galatians, some from James, right? Come to Antioch. That's a theme we've heard in Galatians 2, in case you've forgotten. And they are line 32, Judas and Silas being prophets themselves. So here we have the theme of prophets coming down to Antioch. Again, I'm sure this term prophet is being quite loose. Now you remember that there was a person called Jesus ben Ananias, and he really was a prophet in Josephus, I think. I mean, a prophet, if there ever was one at that time, he was one. And what happened to him? Remember the story I read you? The portents for the fall of Jerusalem? I want you guys to be able to talk to your ministers. I want you to know more than your teachers. How can you know more if you can't toss a name like Jesus ben Ananias around and tell them, hey, do you know who Jesus ben Ananias was? Do you know his prophecy for the fall of Jerusalem? And the guy, they'll look, how do you know that? Hey, I've been reading the scripture. Which you say you do, but maybe you're a little too choose what is suitable to your sermons, and maybe you're not doing an extensive reading of it. In any event, so you can take those if you want, though. So, yeah. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. So. See you when I see you. So, Jesus ben Ananias, you remember, was after Tabernacles, 62 AD, the year of James's death by stoning, according to Josephus. He's crying, Jerusalem is fallen, Jerusalem is fallen. For 7.5 years, without cease, until what happens to him? He's hit on the head with a missile from Roman siege engine, and he says, and now I'm killed too. And Josephus makes a little joke saying, and he was never wrong in any of his prophecies. But, Jesus ben Ananias says, when Jesus in Scripture goes up to the temple, he predicts its fall. So we have a kind of similarity of themes there of Jesus, but Jesus is going up to the temple like 40 years before, according to if you can date him, and no one really has succeeded in giving a date that everyone accepts for Jesus' ministry as such. So this would be something that would be argued, of course. But still, it's a good 40 years. It would be like someone in 1960 telling us that Baghdad was going to fall. Those kind of predictions 40 years earlier are not something that are simple to do. And I'm not totally convinced that we don't have a retrospective reading back into another person's activities of a later Jesus into an earlier Jesus. But we get similarities of that kind. When we said Jerusalem fell because of the death of James, I think that's what the believers thought. But did the really believers in 70 AD think that Jerusalem fell because of the death of Jesus 40 years before? Do we think that America is having problems with France now because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy? You see, history doesn't work that way. I know you say, well, our Jesus was so important that it does, but maybe it does. You have to decide that. But in any case, there are some real prophets. I think you'll find that this Agabus is a compendium of these people. That this Ananias character, who is Paul's companion, remember, in Damascus, also the intermediary in the Agabus correspondence, you're getting a lot of convergence of themes. Also the person involved in the first conversion of Queen Helen, whose conversion is overwritten by a Galilean teacher called Eliezer in Josephus, who wants circumcision. And of course then there's whole, in Galatians, Paul attack on those who are forcing circumcision on you. And then we get the theme of James being of the circumcision. So we have all these themes converging. You say, well, so what? So what? Well, okay, if you think this history is sufficient, forget it. Just follow this. But if you like to go deeper, then try to start putting all those themes. So, I think the Agabus character, pardon me, I caught this cold walking along this slimy river in San Antonio. It's called Riverwalk, but it looks like something where someone could get bilharzius or something, like like some swamp. I was surprised that no alligators were swimming in it to eat the people who fell off the walk. How many have been to San Antonio? It's like this swampy little river walk, and it was raining, and anyway, this is the result. You're looking at it, so that was cute, but obviously, I don't think Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie fought for the Riverwalk restaurant, tourist attraction. I don't think that's what they were up to, but maybe they would have wanted to invest in it. Could have made some money, maybe, if they put their money down then in 1836. They'd probably be rich by 2004. Any case, forget my joking. So we get these people, they come down, and they're prophets, two of them anyway. Silas and Judas come down to Antioch, and what are they coming down with at that point in Acts? James' instructions to overseas communities. I think that's basically what the episode is that keeps being repeated. Have you ever, you know that movie Groundhog Day? That, it keeps on stopping and starting again, and stopping and starting again. I think there's a little bit of that going on here. Now, again, I admit, if you're the believer, you don't have to. I understand you will be offended to some extent, or you will recoil from this, and your first impression will be, oh, there he goes again. But then you'll see that perhaps there is some justification to it, and then you'll have to work it out for yourself. It's not to say that, no one's saying Jesus and James aren't important. We're only saying the people who wrote these documents may not have been as high as their, the people they claim to be writing about. That's often the case, that the writers are not up to the level of the people we're talking about. Because I would give James the highest rating. And if Jesus and James are similar, I'd give them both the highest rating. So I don't think the fact that we maybe have some problem with the portrayal isn't their fault. It's the portrayer's fault. And I don't give Paul very high marks. But that's a matter of taste. If you're a Paul person, boy, you can have them. I'm not going to argue on that point. Because I'm for righteousness, and I think James is certainly, we would all agree, is a righteous person. Yeah.
What if you believe that Jesus was actually for the Jewish and for the Gentiles? Then you would see Paul in a different light, right?
No, because for me, and we'll have another discussion, maybe we would have to have in the office, because it's too long a discussion. But no, because the way the games he plays, the gamesmanship he plays with his arguments, I think are, beyond the pale. Forget the Gentile mission, fair enough. I think there was a Gentile mission. And I think James was involved in a Gentile mission. That's what his rulings are all about. So no one's saying there isn't a Gentile mission. It's just the way Paul goes about it to turn it anti-Semitic. And he certainly, you can see it in his writings. That's what he does. In the heat of battle, he becomes extremely, not just hostile, but almost, his invective goes over the buttons. Look, I might like Lenin, and Lenin's program might have been something like Stalin's, but I don't like Stalin, if I'm a communist. You see what I'm trying to say? So, Lenin is no saint, of course, But you can't excuse the successor just because he may have incorporated some of the master's teaching if his methods are not something that are recommended. They say Lenin was trying to reject Stalin in his later years. I definitely think Jesus would have rejected Paul. That's my personal view. I don't think Jesus would accept a person like this preaching for him. That's just me. Again, all other people. And I think there's a lot of gays and others, lesbians, and people who agree with me at least a bit on that. But if you go deeper into it, I don't think Paul is adding anything to the Jesus teaching that I would consider to be necessary. Anyway, forget all that. The point being, for those people who feel that they're not being given, they're being shortchanged in a way, remember, nothing, the Jesus and the James things are the highest of high events. Nobody denies that. All one's worrying about is how they're being presented here, and if we can rely on it. So we're talking about a very curious being, Agabus. We all back to that, you see? And you all have to agree that that's an odd name. And the whole thing is odd. And we have Ananias as a prophet. And later on, Agabus is going to appear a second time. Who remembers, or having read ahead, knows when he's going to appear a second time?
Ananias?
In Acts when? Acts 21. What's happening in Acts 21 when Agabus appears a second time? Don't let him read it. See if you can remember orally. I can tell you, so you don't remember. He, anyone know, just, hey, I'm the Christian here in the class, then I know the thing better than any Christian here, and then ours that goes, okay? In the room I'm talking about. So we want to get on one of those spin the wheels for questions or something like that, and if you want to see, if you want to illustrate your faith by how many questions you can answer on that spin the thing, what's those quiz programs? What's it called? Wheel of Fortune. We could pick Christianity as subject. I bet I could win a lot of those contests, you know. Anyway, Acts 21, Agabus appears, and he's now, you will remember, he grabs Paul's girdle and ties it in a knot, and he says, this is what the Jews, it's always pretty anti-Semitic stuff, this is what the Jews are going to do to you in Jerusalem if you go up. And Paul rejects him and says, no, I'm going to go up. So his advice in Acts 21, and again, he doesn't come down to Antioch. What does he do? He comes down to Caesarea. So it's another coming down to. Why do people in this period always say coming down to? Because Jerusalem's on a high plateau, or a spur. I don't think it's a plateau, it's like a ridge. It's about 2,100 feet high, and in that part of the region where things are pretty flat, that's quite high. And so it's on a high spine, so it dominates. It's a strategic location because it has water there. That's what makes it, that's the reason for Jerusalem. It's a defensible position, it's strategic, there's water, and it's high, and it's difficult, it's easily defensible, and very difficult to assault. It's a fortified high point along a ridge with water. And that's all you need for a good fortress. So anyone who goes down from Jerusalem, you go down to the coast, you go down to Syria, you go down, and in Hebrew, it's always going up and going down. That's the verbs that they use to talk about. How many have gone up to Jerusalem in this class? On a road? Any of you? Well, you actually do drive up this defile. Now it's lined with vehicles that were destroyed in the 1948 Arab-Israeli war, as mementos of that time, because they had to break through the road under heavy fire and stuff, and so they left the burned out hulks of the trucks that were supplying the city as monuments of the destruction. Now it's a 4-lane superhighway that whizzes past those things. Then it was just a dirt track. So anyway,
by way of contrast, in England we also say going up to London. It's not high.
Yeah, that's weird. That is weird, going up to London. Yeah, that's sort of like going up to the big city, I guess.
Yeah.
Actually, because most of the time in England, map-wise, you're going down to London, aren't you?
Exactly.
Unless you're in the South Counties and you're you know, sort of down by Winchester or Southampton, and you're going up to London, which I can understand. But if I was in Newcastle, I don't think they say going up to London from
My
Newcastle.
relatives in the North Sea, they're going up to London.
Do they really? You're not kidding, because my wife's from the North too, and I've never heard her use that expression. I'll have to ask her about that. We'll argue it out the next time, okay? Anyway, okay. So Agabus is something we want to certainly keep in mind and worry about. So he produces the prophecy of the spirit of the famine, and then we get all the material in chapter 12, where Mary, the mother of John Mark, is introduced. Peter flees. James and the brothers are introduced. No telling who they are. And would you all agree with this? Acts. Okay, noun, verb. As if we already know who he is. Because when he said, and Peter went to Mary, the mother of John Mark's house, to leave a message for James and the brothers, doesn't that really assume that you're supposed to know who James is, that he should have been introduced? Does anyone feel that that's an illegitimate conclusion to draw from that sentence? Now, I know no teacher probably ever brings that to anyone's attention. But to my mind, so we talk about sources here in college courses. What's the source of a given document? Is it built on sources? The two-source hypothesis, the three-source hypothesis, you know, the Q source in the Gospels and so on. What's the source of Acts? What are the documents that went into the writer's final version of these things? So, you know, I would think in the original source there was an introduction of James. Because this looks like we should know who he is. And does this ever tell us who James is? Never. You know, how do we know who James is? How do we have to find out? Forget the early church fathers. How do we have to find out who he is? Have to go to Paul in Galatians. If we didn't have Paul in Galatians, we wouldn't have a clue. We wouldn't have a clue who he is. Well, you could maybe in the Gospel see his mother and his brothers came to him and list the brothers, okay, but this doesn't make it clear that this is one of the brothers of Jesus here, does it? You don't see that anywhere mentioned, do you? There's not one word about that. I think that says something. It says the writers were not happy about that, and for the various reasons, either kept it back, discarded it, deleted it, and therefore you have to have an ideological reason for that, don't you? That's what I'm trying to get at, and I think hopefully you're beginning to see why I've been trying to emphasize these things. And it's not anti-Christian to emphasize these things. I think it's pro-Christian, trying to dig out the people in the real history if they haven't been treated properly. If there's no problem, okay. But now all of you will admit that not to tell us who the leader is who seems to have been over Peter, and not to tell us that he was James's brother, is a big defect of any narrative. I mean, really, what narrative wouldn't tell us that Bobby Kennedy was Jeff Kennedy's brother? I mean, that's something that really, then you have to think that people have an ideological reason for it, and I think that we see that, yeah.
Supposing that the writers didn't leave it out, do you think there was an opportunity for someone else to take it out?
You know, my theory is that they substituted the Judas selection for it. So when the original source had it in it, I do believe. But that's just my theory. Look, it's a theory. And you have to evaluate if you think that's a good theory. You see, the fact that we have an election, which is odd, an election which is, you will admit, basically meaningless. I mean, to put a 12th apostle who doesn't do anything in the whole history that we're aware of into the scheme, and to miss the election of the person who does do something, even in this book, seems odd. So to my mind, it was just have the person said, oh, look, it would be like Nixon, didn't like the way the history was. Look, take that out, put this in. So they wouldn't do that. Yes, when you have parties in struggle, ideological struggle, they would do that, unfortunately. Hey, watch what happens when I leave Cal State Long Beach. I'll be written out. It'll be like I was never here. You know, that's what happens to, you know, if you're adversaries or people who want to promote themselves. This happens to everybody, gets written out. Watch what happens to Michael Eisner at Disney when he goes. He's history, man. And he probably wouldn't even make the history books. I mean, Trotsky, they even ran him down in Mexico and killed him. They were so worked up about him. So yeah, the victors write the histories. I got to keep moving, guys. I know the questions are good, but I'm getting nowhere. Apologize. Okay. So we have another odd situation where Mary, the mother of, we assume it's of God, or at least of James, Simon, Jude, and Joses, if it's not of God, is another odd transformation occurs, and we get a third Mary or a fourth Mary by a fifth Mary. We've got Mary Magdalene, we've got Mary, the mother of James and John in the Gospels. We've got Mary, the mother of Joses, and we've got, you start looking at the number of Marys in the Gospels. And then we've got another one we never heard of, Mary, the mother of John and Mark. I compress all these Marys, except for Mary Magdalene. I compress all these Marys into one Mary. Mary, the mother of God, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And what I say is going on here is the editors later are having problems with the doctrines relating to her status.
Nowhere in the Bible does it say that Mary had other children. They refer to her as mother of Jesus, and then they refer to the brothers of the Lord. But I have one question that's troubling.
Wait, now you lost me with that question.
In the Bible, they refer to Mary as mother of Jesus, but they never refer to that Mary as having other children. They only refer to...
Well, we don't argue that. That's a start with Jesus' point, but you're wrong.
Okay.
They talk about Mary, the mother of James, Joses, Salome, and who are the brothers of Jesus in that in those other presentations.
I have a question.
Or it says Mary and his brothers came to him. So in fact, it definitely has Mary. It also has Mary, the sister of her own sister Mary, the wife. So only in the Gospel of John, I think, do you not have Mary related to the brothers. Because the Gospel of John have separated them out into two Marys. That's what I'm saying. You get a multiplication of Marys. There's a double Mary in John. Anyway, this is beyond where we are. You know, you got too many questions. It's fine. I'm not waiting. You got too many questions, but I'm going to take your question, which is good. But I got to move. Don't forget. So give me your question so I can move.
At the foot of the cross, Jesus tells John, "This is your mother," basically to take care of her.
Yeah.
She had other children. You know that in the Jewish faith, as well as like in my faith, the children would have to take care of their own parents. So why would Jesus tell John to take care of Mary if she had other children?
It says, take her into your own house. I've analyzed that in my James, the brother of Jesus book, and I can't remember the whole analysis. Those kind of questions we're going to have to come to the office because it's really off the topic here. It's going to, you know, I know you're full of these questions, but I'd appreciate if you read James, the brother of Jesus, and then come with the questions, because most of that I've gone into the best I can in great detail, and trying to give the analysis on 1 foot would be pretty difficult. I think part of it is that the disciple Jesus loved, most people assume is John, but a lot of other people think it's actually James. And there's also in the apocryphal Gospels Jesus kissing James on the mouth. And it's a very complicated story, and therefore, it can't be done on 1 foot. And you tend to take the Gospels at face value, and most academics, just like Acts, don't take them at face value. But we've been over this ground, and I've really got to keep moving. I apologize to you. It's a good question, but it would take a whole class probably to answer. I'm not trying to fob it off, but it's a very complicated thing, and I think I've done it in a chapter. Look up in my index in that book, and you should find some things about that. Any case, coming back. So we have a new character, Mary, the mother of John Mark. She's just called attention to how many Marys there really are again, and now we have another Mary, and as I said, in my theories, I collapse them into one basic Mary. If it's a mother of, it's mother of either the Jesus or the brothers. And it's not surprising, therefore, that someone would go to her house to leave a message for James, isn't it? Just that the writer doesn't want to go further than that. The writer doesn't want to tell us these family relations because the writer is a Paulinist and is not happy with the family leadership of the early church. It's like Islam. If you're familiar with Islam, the Ali party, the family party, is against the Sunni party, the more like the consensus companions, apostles party. And you can watch how Islam developed in a very similar manner, that the consensus Sunni party wins out over the family party, the Ali Shiite party. But they're still fighting today. The only problem with Christianity today, we don't have any Jamesians left except here in this room. But it turns out the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, have come along to restore that balance. And that's going to be look, 10 years ago, no one even heard the name James. I was at this conference and people were saying, and Jesus and his brother James, as if it was just common knowledge. So in 10 years, we've gone that far in this promoting the importance of James in the consciousness of people. And I think we started right here at Cal State Long Beach. So I'm not trying to be right in your classes, right here. It's amazing how far those things can go. You'd be amazed. And I can assure you, 20 years ago, no one spoke about this character. It was totally unknown. 10 beginning to be known, and now everybody knows him. So it's quite a movement. And the ossuary, of course, has just pushed it forward, even though it's a fake ossuary. But the reason that it came into existence is because we'd already started talking about James, and so the forger said, "Oh, hey, we can sell that ossuary for big money now." And off they went and produced it. We had a lecture on the ossuary there at the conference, and the Israeli authorities who had investigated were absolutely livid at the magazine that promoted it, and said that they were exploiting people's faith and that they were involved in criminal actions. They'd been in this man's laboratory, the man who supposedly bought this thing, and he had around 10 different forgeries going at the same time with all the equipment and all the materials needed to make forgeries, and he had 10 things in the process of forging then when they came into his laboratories. And the people still want to deny that, they still want to convince themselves that that isn't too good to be true, basically. Okay, at the end of this chapter, we have Herod presented to you again. He killed John with the sword at the beginning. He died eaten by worms. And if you know your Josephus, which I didn't force you to read, but I've read passages that were exerted in Eusebius, that is really supposed to be Agrippa 1. That's Agrippa 1. I don't have a thing, but I'll write on here, Agrippa 1, okay? You can do cipher writing and take it off the coded blackboard. Agrippa, Agrippa 1. And we know that's around 44 AD. It isn't presented exactly this way, but he does die in an odd way. He was on a stage, and he was sort of posturing in this play like a god-like figure, and suddenly he became ill. He probably was poisoned. What it turns out, Agrippa 1 is one of the Maccabean descendants. I don't have my pen with me, but one of the Maccabean descendants who has, one of the Herodian descendants, pardon me, who has Maccabean blood. And they're the most important ones. And the ones who have the Maccabean blood, he has in the genealogies in the back of that James book, which I signed for this class, so I think you should buy it. I'll sign it if you do. That might be worth that and a nickel. Get you a cup of coffee maybe 20 years from now, but maybe it'll be worth more than that, who knows. In any event, the Maccabees were the Jewish rulers who were legitimate to some extent and were priest kings. Now Herod married one of their daughters among his 10 other wives. So he had lots of descendants like a Saudi sheikh would have, but of the 10 other wives, they weren't reckoned by the people as so important because most of them weren't even Jewish wives, so obviously a Jewish country wouldn't reckon that. You know, Yasser Arafat's having the same trouble now. His wife is looked upon as some sort of weirdo, and you know, the legitimacy of what she's trying to do doesn't go very deep among the Palestinian people. You have, you know, foreign wives and things like that. It's not going to. They're not going to have as much substance as a native-born wife, child. Well, he kills his 2 offspring by this Maccabean wife, and he kills her too, having accused her. Her name was Mary, interestingly enough, Miriam, and I think that's where all these Marys come from, honoring her memory. That's why I think this is all very Maccabean memory-oriented. And that's the original Mary and Joseph affair, because Herod's brother-in-law was called Joseph, and he accused Mary of having had an affair with his brother-in-law when he went to Rome, and he executed them both. That's the original Mary-Joseph situation back in the, but anyway, a lot of these Marys, I think, are born in the next generation, be that as it may. But Herod, it's not enough for Herod. He's such a monster. I mean, the only thing you can compare Herod to is Saddam Hussein, I think. He's such a monster. And we don't call Saddam Hussein great, so I don't think we should call Herod great. I think we should call him Herod the Monster or Herod the Terrible, like Ivan the Terrible, but not Herod the Great. The only reason people call him Herod the Great is to distinguish him from all his lesser descendants. And also, because some people think he did good, you know, impressive building projects. Well, all the others have all these different people who are called Herods as well, so it gets all very confusing as we've seen. But the real line descended from this Maccabean princess are 2 brothers that are killed, but not before they themselves have had children. They're killed in their maturity because Herod thought they were going to supplant him. So he kills his own children and his wife, but he doesn't kill the grandchildren. They go to Rome for their education, and one of these grandchildren is Agrippa I. And he's the one brought up with Roman emperors to be, which is how he comes back to Palestine after Tiberius, the Roman emperor, dies or is murdered at around 37 AD or so. Agrippa is appointed king because he was of kingly blood from his mother's and his father's side, if you want to say, grandmother's, grandfather's side. The Romans appreciated that, and also he'd been brought up with the 2 Roman individuals who take over the kingship or the emperorship in Rome, Caligula and Claudius, who both like him because they were brought up with him. And his name, that is called Herod, of course. They're all Herods, but he's Herod Agrippa I. And that's who this is probably supposed to be, Agrippa I. But there's one thing about Agrippa I. He was very popular among the people in Palestine for some reason, because he at least came back and tried to be Jewish in the way he presented himself. He observed Jewish custom. We know all this from Josephus and the Talmud. He was the only Herodian that did this. And then it looks like that he had pretensions of trying to get an empire together in the East under his own control, because you know, he had seen the way things worked in Rome. And I think the Romans became suspicious of him and disposed of him because they were worried about what he was, what his pretensions were, what he was trying to do. Now, he had a brother also called Herod, but actually named Herod. And this fellow was called Herod of Chalcis. He succeeded him for 3 or 4 years as king. So this person who killed with the sword could be his brother, and imprisoned Peter could be his brother, could be him. It looks like it's his brother who would do these things, imprison people like Peter. Agrippa I would not have done those things. He was too clever. He didn't like to alienate the people. He certainly would not imprison popular leaders. So he was, but the other one did, and he had a big repression after Agrippa I died under these mysterious circumstances. It's his son, I know I'm confusing you here, Herod of Chalcis, which is a town in Syria, who later became king for 4 or 5 years, from 44 to 49 after, I got all the dates in the back of the James book. He did have a repression in Josephus, but it was his son who married Salome. Salome involved in the death of John the Baptist according to the Gospels, after she left her other husbands. So she'd already been through a few husbands by the time she married his son. And they got a kingdom in Asia Minor. I think it was Little Armenia. And they, I think I mentioned this to you before, their picture is on coins from Little Armenia. The Romans gave them a kingdom, and they're portrayed there. There should be a picture of Salome on one of the coins. And it's, they called themselves great lovers of Caesar. I'm sure they were, but maybe they actually were as well. Maybe there was a threesome going on there. Some of those Caesars were pretty wild, according to Suetonius. So the lovers could have been a double entendre in the case of their coinage. And it wouldn't surprise me a single bit if that were the case. Anyway, why is she again so sought after? Well, that's by the way, a cousin marriage there, because the man she married was the son of Herod, and she was the daughter of Herodias, and Herodias was Agrippa I's sister. I know this is very complicated. So Herodias was the Maccabean princess line still, and therefore Salome would be too, if you want to go for the bloodline. So I have that all in the genealogies in the back of the James book, don't I? I just hold them up so these people believe us, yeah. Yeah, you see we have the Maccabean ones here, and then we have the Herodian ones spread across the whole page here. And we can tell you who these people are, and we have all the dates in the back here. So with some good maps and things, so it's worth having, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth having. It's worth having.
Good reading too.
If you have the time. All right, so I think we're getting a mixture of things going on here. I hope I haven't lost you. One, the imprisonment of Peter would have been under, I think, Herod of Chalcis this time. The killing of James, the brother of John, whoever he's supposed to be, would have been Herod of Chalcis. Agrippa I wouldn't have done this. The death here is Agrippa I's death. So we're telescoping several events here together, and you say, well, Eisenman, you think you know the history better than this guy? You're 2,000 years later. Yeah, I do. I think I do. Because I think this person was pretty slapdash in the way he or she presented things until Acts 16, when things get much more careful when the we document comes in. I think this is an attempt by an amateur to recreate some things on the basis of some sources that he's kind of juggling around and has ideological axe to grind. Have I made my point there? But by the time when you get to 16, then it gets more serious. And we'll show you that, and it gets less confusing too. Anyway, he died being eaten up by worms, and Paul and Barnabas returned from Jerusalem, having completed their mission, bringing with them John Mark, right? Yeah, but what they do there? They completed their mission. What? You see, all this has been put in the middle of where the mission was supposed to be. So again, we have a complaint to the author here. Now, if you're a religious person solely and not interested in academia or historical studies or what we're trying to do at this campus, that's so sufficient for you, it won't bother you. But if you are not just interested in this for religious reasons, then of course you're going to be, that's going to be worrisome again. So all this mounts up to the point is you get your confidence in Acts, it really deteriorates. Because you want to know, well, if I got this paper in my class, I'd give it a C. If you said, I'm going to tell you about Paul and Barnabas, this is, famine relief mission, and then went on to write about something else, and then suddenly at the very end say, and they returned and never told me anything about it. I'd say, I put a big question mark in your paper, but this is the Bible. You can't do it. But you would if you were the teacher. So don't, I know that the messenger is the one who gets the bad rap, but don't rap me. Rap the guy who did this. 13. Certain prophets and teachers, back to this theme, in Antioch. Remember, we're worried about which Antioch this is. But here they are. Barnabas, Simeon, called Niger, whoever that was. Niger means shoemaker, but something else. There was a Niger in Josephus. who is one of the revolutionary leaders, who has a death in Josephus at the time of the war against Rome, very much like Jesus. He carries his own cross out of a city and stuff. It's a very interesting parallel. I've always been curious about the Niger. It can also mean black in Greek too. Lucius the Cyrenian, who I think is Luke, to whom we attribute this. Cyrene is where? North Africa, next to Egypt, present-day Libya. These are the prophets and teachers who whatever we want to make up. Now, a really weird name. Manan. Mayonnaise. Manan. There may have been such a person. It's a possible Greek. I don't think is you'll find any other person never named that in any Greek literature. I think it's another one of these garbles. I'll tell you who I think it is. I'll bet you already know who I think it is. Anyway, the interesting aside is he was Herod the Tetrarch's foster brother. That is, he was a close relative and brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, who's a nasty piece of work, as we know. Who's Herod the Tetrarch again? He's Herod Antipas, not one of the Maccabean lines, but he's married to Herodias, which brings about the death of John the Baptist. He takes Philip's wife, or whoever, if it was Philip or another individual. Anyway, he's the one who gets, why they all want Herodias? She's his niece marriage condemned in the scrolls, but also she's the Maccabean line, so they can plug into that line, they're going to get favorites in Rome, and probably that's the richest line. That is, why is it the Maccabean line? Herod's wife, who was a Maccabean princess, the only one who had any legitimacy in the eyes of the people. All right, here's a foster brother of that person who we know was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. Now, that is, I think you will go around this room. Anyone who doesn't like me, I understand your feelings, but on this score, you can't disagree. We know Herod the Tetrarch was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. Anyone want to gainsay me on that? No, you won't, I'm sure. And he was not a nice person. Can we all agree on that? He's a blue meanie. A foster brother of his is among the founding members of the church in so-called Antioch, wherever that is. Okay, I think that's a tremendously important notice. I think about the only human being in history of the church, that is, who ever even paid any attention to it. Because I was not interested in it, but I care about things like that. Barnabas, we know, it's all. So, I think a little bit of a shell game is going on here again. Because of the theory I've already enunciated to you, right or wrong, that Paul was an Herodian. That it's actually Paul who's the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. And all they've done in the same way that they've done with the Peter, John, and James, his brother, they've made the brother look like the brother of John and not the brother of Jesus. In this case, the foster brother, because that is embarrassing material, the writers would know, just moved over to here. From here, they say, oh, come on, Professor Eisenman, you're at it again. Yeah, once you start this, but I mean, there is some basis for thinking it. If Saul is a Herodian, and in the genealogies, what's your last name, sir? I forgot your last name. Robeson. Mr. Robeson will tell you that in the genealogies in the back of the book, we do pinpoint a character that could be Paul. There is a Saulus in the genealogies, and he is related to these other Herodians. In case you're interested. You didn't see that, Mr. Robeson? I'm surprised. I thought you'd have jumped on that one. Let's see. You look surprised at that. So he's got Herod the Tetrarch, Antipas circled here, but there's this little Saulus over here in the genealogies over here. He has some Idumean background. So, he could be, he certainly related to all these other people. And anyway, you can see him in the genealogies. There's one Saul in the genealogies, and he does play a part in Josephus. And he does appeal to Rome, and he does go to Rome to report to the emperor. And he's quite an important person. He's the intermediary between the Roman forces besieging the city and the peace party inside the city. And then he goes to Nero and reports on the situation in Palestine, and he's never heard from again. So the last we hear of him in Josephus is approximately 66 AD. The same as in Acts. The last we hear of Paul is around that time, but Acts doesn't tell us what happened to Paul. Neither does Josephus tell us what happens to Saul, the Herodian prince. Now, if there's any, and I'll say that's provable, none of this is provable, but there's something to think about. Then who is Manaen? Oh, I think it's just Paul's old friend Ananias, garbled. This is what happens, like Abgarus, the letters get moved around in transcription and from one language to another. Yeah, I think, yeah, Manaen. Well, who are we missing here? Ananias. That's the person who converted Paul. That's the person who's in Antioch. We know he's in Antioch all the time. Why isn't he among these people? Yeah, he is. He's Manaen. Oh, well, so he's the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. No, I don't think so. I think Saulus is the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. But anyway, be that as it may. Or else, maybe none of it's correct what I'm saying. But that's for you to think about, okay? This is just food for thought. Okay. It doesn't hurt anything. It's just something to think about. There's no finality. You're the final judge of these things. And all it does is increase your knowledge and your ability to, control the material, which others haven't even imagined. So you're ahead of a lot of people there. What do others do? They just read this. So, and we can read that. We can do that in 5th grade. So, if you just want to read it, well, we give a 5th grade class and give you a test. Who were the founding fathers of the church at Antioch? Okay, Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius, Cyrenian, Manaen, and there, A. You answered it right. But if we want to know more, then we have the ability to try to do that. So that's what we're doing. Chapter 13. So now the Holy Spirit said, separate both Barnabas and Saul to me. That's interesting, because it links up with Dead Sea Scroll language about separate. Nazarite. Nazarite means make separate. So we're going to separate them out. Give them to me, says the Holy Spirit, because I have called them. Here's the calling word, and for some work that I need. This is usually presented as the first missionary journey. And the Acts has 3 or 4 missionary journeys. I'm not sure we can really separate them out so easily as 1, 2, 3, and 4, which everyone tries to do just by taking Acts at face value. But I think basically we have one big missionary journey by Paul. One big missionary journey by Paul. But Acts is working like this. So can we keep following it? You don't mind? Let's go. Let's keep following it. So they come. So they're on the way. Now we're in the big time. We're going overseas. And it looks like the Holy Spirit is the thing that's dictating this. Barnabas and Saul are carrying the ball, right? The other, Barnabas wasn't even an original apostle either, was he? The other apostles have really gone out of this narrative, except for the Jerusalem conference that's going to come, but we're not going to hear about them at all anymore. From now on, from chapter 8 or 9 it's been Paul, but really from 13 on it's Paul. And the problem too, we never hear what happens to the other ones. We don't get Peter's death, we don't get James's death. You'd think we would like to know something about that, but we've covered that enough. So off to Cyprus they go. Cyprus is a weird name. Often it has to do with characters like Barnabas, who say come from there. But Cyprus, has in the original language, is sometimes called Kit, which is like Crete. The Kittim in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the enemies from overseas are called the Kittim, probably originally in Crete back in the days of the Cretan Empire, but now places like Cyprus, Western Islands. And then the Sumerians, for some reason, are called Kutaans in Hebrew literature. And sometimes Cyprus can mean Samaria, even though it seems to mean Cyprus. So there's a lot of slipping in the names. But let's accept this as Cyprus, the real Cyprus. Salamis is a town in the real Cyprus, and where's the first place they go? To the synagogues. Why do they go to the synagogues? Oh, because there's fertile territory for them to operate within. But in Galatians, we heard they weren't going to go to the synagogues. We heard that the apostles were going to go to the synagogues. Do you remember that? I mean, do I have to read it again to you? So right away, everything Paul does is against the agreement that he pictures himself as having made here. And when they saw 2:9, the grace which was given to me, James, Cephas, not Peter, and John, gave these esteemed pillars. Earlier he said, not that the importance means anything to him, gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcision. The only thing that we should do is remember the poor. So the normal apostles were only going to go to the circumcised, the Jews. And they were, the others, that was the only caveat, that they should stay away from the Jews, right? Take their message to the non-Jews only. Would you not agree that's more or less what's said there? But you can study it on your own time. Well, he right away goes to the synagogues where the Jews are. Maybe there's others there too, and starts talking in the synagogues. And of course, he upsets all of the Jews. The apostles are aware he's going to do that if he starts talking about the things he talks about. But nothing loath, that's what he does. So all I can say is that he's not a good trooper. I mean, I have to be honest with you, he may be a big success, and as you said, if this was Jesus' message, then this is okay. But no, to my mind, he's not a man of honor. Otherwise, he would keep the agreement. But what's the problem with keeping the agreement? And as any traveling salesman will tell you, you've got to go to where the customers are. Well, when you go to where the customers are, sometimes you cut in on other people's turf and terrain, and you cause enemies and ill will. And, you know, Paul's got his message, they've got their message. But I can tell you this, there's not one episode here that Paul doesn't go straight to the synagogues to try to, you know, get involved with the people. And he just doesn't speak to non-circumcised people, he speaks to both. And primarily people in the synagogue are going to be circumcised people anyway. So he's just not keeping the message, the deal that he himself said he struck. So, you know, honestly, if you're fair-minded, you would have to acknowledge that even you think he's justified that he's not keeping the bargain that he said he struck, if that's an accurate picture. Now, suppose I was Jesus and came to judge this. Would I be happy about Paul's work? No, I don't think Jesus wants things done in an illegitimate way. He's too high for that. That's my Jesus. You can choose. Now, if your Jesus is like who's the Raider coach? Al Davis, who had the philosophy of win, baby, just win. You know, that's his philosophy. If you win at any cost, and that seems to have been the way a lot of people went about this business, including Constantine, Eusebius, and all the people who went to Spanish America and to the eastern parts of Europe and places, win at any cost, including killing off all the poor Indians and everything in the process, or enslaving them to the missions up here. That's the Pauline ethos, and I think that's not the ethos that good Christians want in their Christianity as a righteous thing. So I don't think it's improper to point this out. Anyway, you have to decide that. We all agree if Acts is historical, and I'm not sure it always is, maybe Acts isn't accurate, he goes right to the synagogues, and as well he might, because that's where the business is. The Jews have already laid the foundation, the groundwork before him, because there's a lot of people interested in Judaism. All Paul is doing was getting in there with a Hellenized message that can make it easier on the people who are being interested in the synagogues, that they don't have to come into the law and circumcise themselves, because that would be a difficult process for them. So Paul's giving them a version of things that they can plug into that relates to the Greek mystery religions. I mean, sure he's going to win the day. Sure he's going to win the day, particularly if he's got Roman troops to back him up that's going to crush the Jerusalem center in around 10 years and demolish it. And wipe the Jerusalem church out, so the whole leadership is gone. Well, Paul has got a free field, totally free field, and his form of Christianity is obviously going to win, and it does. But I'm not sure that's Jesus' form of Christianity. That's Jude's itself. Anyway, that's where he goes, to the synagogues, and to my mind, that's not what I would do. I would not go in on other people's turf. If my message was so powerful, I would go out on the streets, and I would go into the temples of the pagans, and I would go to other places and proclaim my message. I wouldn't take advantage of other people's work before me. To me, to my mind, and not to the people who think that that's fine, to my mind that's cheesy. It's not honorable. You decide. But Paul doesn't care about that. He says, what does he say in Corinthians? I believe in winning. That's how I fight, not beating the air. We read you that. I'll read it again, just in case you forgot. He is, again, that philosophy that I consider to be Al Davis and Vince Lombardi and the modern man. What then is my reward? 9:18, 1 Corinthians. In preaching the gospel, I should make the gospel of Christ free, so I not misuse my authority, for being free from all. See, I'm free under the law. I'm a free man. I'm a Roman citizenship. I myself became a slave to all, ingratiating himself to you, but not slave to the law, you see, so that I might gain the most. But I do it as a kind of strategy, a business strategy. I'm playing a game of salesmanship here. So I become under the law, okay, so I can gain those under the law. And to those outside the law, I am as outside the law. Not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might gain those outside the law. For anyone weak, I become weak, so I might gain the weak. So all those have become all things, so I am by all means might save some. And to this for the sake of the gospel, etc., etc. Do you know the ones who run a race now use stadium athletics to describe his method, which would be horrifying in Palestine? Greek stadium, Olympic athletics, where they all ran naked in all of their bodies. Only one receives the prize. So run that way to win, he says. There he puts it. Run to win. It doesn't matter the way. The end justifies the means here. Run to win. Now, I know I'm giving a very jaundiced view of this, but if you can present this in any more, this is what he's saying, maybe you think it's right, but in any case, some people would think it's not their style. It wasn't James's style, therefore he lost. But everyone who tries to win in all things controls himself. You got to keep your body under control. That's how I do it, so that you can win an eternal crown that lasts forever. So you shouldn't be running uncertainly nor beating the air like a boxer, just beating nothing, man. You should be out there fighting the way you should fight. I keep my body under discipline and bring it into good training, lest I should be rejected myself, having preached as well. Anyway, he's a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jew, a lawkeeper to the lawkeeper, lawbreaker to the lawbreaker. Anything he has to do to win, he believes in winning, and he does win. And part of his philosophy of winning is to go right to the synagogues when he said he wouldn't. How come James loses? Because James wouldn't do this. James won't make things easier on people, and so on, if he doesn't believe in it. So you say, well, Paul's right. Well, that's where the debate in your soul must come. Anyway, he meets a magician here on Cyprus, Paphos, called Bar Jesus, a Jew. And he also meets a proconsul with the strange name of Sergius Paulus. Maybe that's how he took his name, from this being adopted by this proconsul. We don't know. It's all very curious here. And hearing the word of God, he talked to this magician, Elymas, which also means sorcerer or magician in Greek. So basically this guy is called magician. Twin, right. It's another of those twin deals. For that's the meaning of his name, you see. Elymas is the magician because Elymas means magician. Opposed to them, and so they all have an argument, and Paul stares him down and fixes his eyes on him, and he says, "You son of the devil, full of tricks and cunning, you enemy," uses the enemy terminology there. Now we know how some groups were using the enemy terminology against Paul. Paul uses it against this magician or whoever he is. Perverting the right ways of the Lord. And anyway, he was immediately struck dumb, darkness fell on him, and everyone was amazed until Paul wins that one with the magician. I think this is supposed to be Simon Magus here. And that's why Cyprus, I think, is Samaria, really. This is a representative. They're not all these magicians running around here. This is a Simon Magus figure. The Elymas probably put, and this again hooks up with the Pseudo-Clementines. And the enemy terminology, Simon Magus appears in there. I can't go any further than that, but that's what happens on Cyprus, plus meeting Paulus. Off we go, line 13, to the next place. He leaves Cyprus, and he goes to Asia Minor, Pamphylia. And then an interesting thing occurs. Line 13, John left them and returned to Jerusalem. How many see that? Good if you have a Bible, because then you can mark it and you can refer to it, because it's worth looking at. Would you admit that that's a neutral statement? It doesn't say positive, negative. It doesn't say the reason why. It's just what we would call in English laconic, right? John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Is there any problem here? No, it doesn't seem to be. Is there any dissatisfaction? Any anger? Doesn't look like it. He just left and returned to Jerusalem, right? Wrong. We're going to hear in chapter 16 or 15 at the end of the Jerusalem conference, when they're starting out on another trip, go up to and show you here, then they're going to go and do some other traveling after the conference here. Line 36, after they come down with James's letters. You with me?
What chapter?
15. I can win that program with a spinning wheel. If we had two people, who had to be asked the questions here, I could probably win. I could probably make a lot of money on this if I got a quiz program. But after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Now let us return and look after our brothers." This is after the Jerusalem conference, and they come down to Antioch. "In every city which we preached," another missionary journey, the third or the second. I don't think these are all separate, but anyway. And Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them. John Mark is probably Mark, the author of the gospel that we call Mark. But Paul did not agree. It was good to take the one who had deserted their work in Pamphylia. So for Paul, he was deserted them. And there became a sharp fit of argument, anger between them. So they separated from each other. And Barnabas took Mark and sailed away to Cyprus. And it's at this point that Paul chooses new traveling companions, Silas and some others. And we never hear of Barnabas again either in the narrative. Now we already know in Galatians Barnabas broke from Paul when it was over the son from James, remember? And Barnabas and Peter both stopped keeping company with Paul, and Paul attacks them as hypocrites. I think this is Acts' version of the same thing. Acts knows that Barnabas and Paul have fallen out. But Acts adds this other character, John Mark, and now we know that John Mark has done something. And what does John Mark do? I think if this is reliable, I don't know if it is. He's gone back to Jerusalem and reported on his activities and how he's conducting himself overseas and how he's carrying out his responsibilities. That's why Paul is so angry. And that's why the Jerusalem community seems to know what Paul's been doing and why they call him to account in the matter of the Jerusalem conference, or in when he supposedly goes up to Jerusalem in Galatians. John Mark is, if you like, the spy or whatever. Anyway, John Mark is not a spy. He's someone who's unhappy, obviously, at how Paul's conducting himself. And I assume the unhappiness, and this is jumping ahead, has to do with the fact that Paul wasn't supposed to be doing the things that he was doing. And he just went back to tell the people in Jerusalem this. And I think that when the leadership of Jerusalem would have heard that, they would have been worried about that too. Anyway, it's just a theory. But if you have a better one to explain what this falling out's about, you'll certainly be a wiser person than myself. Anyway, he's in Pamphylia, and he goes into a synagogue again. First place, into the synagogue. There's another Antioch, this time at Pisidia. So there's at least two Antiochs in Acts. This one, by the way, is further north in Asia Minor. And as it turns out, Edessa is a third Antioch, and it turns out Bosra is a fourth Antioch. But we have at least two here. Anyway, Paul, there's the Sabbath, and the law is read, and the rulers of the synagogue say, if anyone wants to make a speech, please do so. We welcome people, guests, visitors here. They're very liberal, you see. And according to this presentation, until they hear what he has to say. Then again, Paul gets up, he makes a speech. But notice his speech is addressed to Israelites and those fearing God. Remember what we said those fearing God are? God-fearers. The associated Gentiles at the synagogues. But he's talking to Israelites, first of all. Again, he tells them their whole history here. And then about Jesus. And 26, he talks about fearing God again. And speaks about Jesus in line 33. You are my son. Quotation from the second Psalm. Today I have begotten you, which is the what's called out at the baptism according to the apocryphal Gospels and Hebrews. In the normal Gospels, it's you are my son, in you I am well pleased. But I think this may be more like what was originally considered to be said. But that would make it some adoptionist type of sonship, or not an actual physical sonship. Anyway, so he goes on in this vein. Now the Jews, 42 as usual, are the meanies. And after things had broken up, many of the Jews and devoted followers followed Paul. But on the next Sabbath, seeing all the multitudes who were now coming, the Jews were filled with envy and denied the things. So here we get the same picture of the Jews as nasty people, even though they gave Paul the audience. But the Jews, line 50, stirred up the devoted honorable women and chief men and raised a persecution, and they expelled them out of the city, and they shook the dust off their feet. The next thing they do, chapter 14, enter the next synagogue. Well, if you're having trouble in synagogue after synagogue, why would you do this? Do you deliberately want to go around and upset people? Would I, for instance, go down to Orange County with the things that I say and go into every church and start preaching this and upset all those poor people without expecting ramification? Of course they'd be upset and angry. That would be bad manners on my part to do that. But, of course, if you're a believer, you think it's great because it's propagating your faith. But think of it in other terms. Is this nice manners to do? To walk into these places and upset people who have their own views and so on and so forth? So you see, there's one way of looking at it, and there's another way. But the main thing is the act is repeated over and over and over again. So the missionary journeys are basically the same. Go into a synagogue where the Jews are, upset the Jews, and try to siphon off some of the others who are there, who are interested in Judaism for some reason or other, into this new form that Paul is preaching in his new message. And that's the picture here next, and that's what we'll bring on next time. You have to evaluate how you think you would feel that happened if it happened in your church. You have to decide. See you next time. Oh, have a good Thanksgiving. So next time, by the way, we'll do all that. We'll finish up the journeys. Now we're going to get into real interesting stuff. I want to get through the missionary journeys quickly because they basically are a repeat over and over. Basically the same thing happens. We want to do the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15 next time, and then we want to do Paul's final confrontations in Jerusalem in the week or so following that, because that's the climax of Acts.
Are you
The
signing
final
a paper
confrontation.
next week?
Huh?
The paper, the research paper?
What about it?
Are you signing it anytime? Or is there a due date?
Hold on, let me get this here. Let me talk about the paper, since we seem to have a confusion about that. I don't